So our next speaker is Professor Keith Fox, who's the Associate Director of the Faraday Institute. He's also Professor of Biochemistry at Southampton University, where he studies all things to do with DNA. And he's the editor of 2 journals. One is Nucleic Acid Research, and the other one is Science and Christian Belief. And he's a lay reader in the Church of England, which is, so he's uniquely qualified to give this talk, which is on
bioethics.
On bioethics. Thank you, Keith.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you for your introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I forgot to put my title on the slide, and it's Contemporary Bioethical Issues for today. I hope that in what Ruth introduced us to earlier on is that we're not necessarily afraid of science, and that we actually see that science has enabled us to see lots of new things about the world and the wonder of the world. And as scientists, we simply explore what God has done and reveal more and more of the wonders. And that fills us with awe. It fills us with a sense of mystery sometimes, and certainly a sense of fascination and fun. Science, I would say, is God's gift to us. It enables us to explore the amazing world around us. And generally speaking, the science itself is what I would describe as ethically neutral. We're just finding out about the way the world works. But the way we apply that science and the technologies that we develop from that often is not scientifically, is not ethically neutral. And hence, we're going to be talking this afternoon about the whole area of bioethics, about some of the discoveries in biology, molecular biology in particular, and how they impact on Christian understandings of what it means to be human and the ways in which we should behave. I wonder if I should throw out to you if I say bioethics, and ethics is not a county somewhere in the southeast of England, what comes to your mind? Just shout out a few things. GM food, thank you. We will touch on GM. Genome modification, thank you. We will touch on genome modification. Stem cells. We might touch on stem cells if I'm brave as we go through. Yeah.
Dolly the sheep.
Dolly the sheep, yeah? I'll probably skip Dolly the sheep, yeah?
Going back, eugenics.
Eugenics, yes, okay, thank you. Prolonging life. There are a whole load of things that you've come up with. I went to a website that gave me that as a list. So it's a great long list of things varying between the human genome, things that we can do with that related to human health, environmental ethics. Nobody mentioned that as a bioethical issue. Animal ethics. That's one website. You go to another one and you get another great long list of things to do with forensics and genetic screening and healthcare, and so on and so on. There are lots and lots of things that are thrown up. So roughly where I think we're going to go today, and we'll see how the time goes, is firstly actually taking a step back and ask ourselves, how do we make ethical decisions as human beings? How do we do that? And particularly as Christians, how do we do that? Well then, because it's my own discipline, I'm fascinated by DNA. I could try and persuade you that it is the most interesting molecule in the whole universe. Others might take exception to that. So we'll take a little bit about DNA and about genetic modification. We'll talk about DNA sequencing and our genomes, something about stem cells if I'm brave, something about gene correction and human enhancement. So that's roughly where we're going. But as we go there, I want us to remember a few things as Christians and our responsibility. One is that we need to be asking the question in all of this, is how can we best care for the world that God has entrusted to us? And how can we show compassion and healing both for the world and for other people? So I say the world, I'm taking that in its broadest context of those who live in it and the organisms that live in it, as well as just the physical, material world of the geography of it. And then ask the question too, what does it mean to be human? And particularly, what does it mean to be made in the image of God? And how do any of our discoveries threaten or challenge that, or vice versa? How can we use the image of God imagery in order to be able to say what we should and shouldn't do? We also need to be aware that not everybody appreciates us. Here is Steven Pinker, who's already been mentioned. I'm sure you've seen him as a bit of an American media star sociologist. So he basically, writing in the Boston Globe, says it's the job of bioethicists just to get out the way. Leave us alone to get on with the science, and don't talk about principles such as dignity and sacredness and social justice. It'll all iron itself out in the end. And Steve Jones, who's closer to home, is Professor of Genetics at University College London, basically says when it comes to any form of research, society will accept it if it works. Ethics, he says, has always followed the science. It's never led it. I don't see any reason why we should change that now. And then people aren't going to listen anyway. I think that's a rather depressing view for those of us who are Christians. I think we should try and be ahead of the curve and actually saying things in advance, not trying to play catch up all the time. Some of the things I'm going to talk about to you may seem like science fiction, but you don't have to wind the clock very far back to realize today's science fiction very quickly becomes tomorrow's science fact. And some of the things may never happen, but it's well worth thinking them through first of all, so that we are prepared in advance. And in some occasions doing our utmost to try and make sure they don't happen, or if they do, that they're done within a proper ethical framework. The other thing about anything to do with science and the way in which it impacts on society and ethics is it's easy to speak out of ignorance. Lots of knee-jerk responses to genetic modification, to all kinds of the issues we'll be talking about without actually knowing exactly what the science is. And so I think it is important for us to know the science, and I'll spend a little bit of time explaining the science as well as the ethics. And there's a rather old quote from Augustine talking about those who dare to speak without really any sense of knowledge and do so supposedly as Christians, and they're an embarrassment. They talk nonsense on these topics. We should take all means to prevent such an embarrassing situation in which people show a vast ignorance in a Christian and laugh it to scorn. So I'm hoping that as we talk about the ethics, that we will at least understand the science that lies behind that, rather than assume we know it. So how do we make ethical decisions? We need to beware, we start, of two extremes, what I call the yuck factor or the wow factor. The yuck factor is that just seems horrible. Right? It's a gut reaction that says we couldn't possibly do that. Lots of medical procedures have a lot of yuck to them, but they're not unethical. How many people faint at the sight of blood? And you can't do surgery without that sort of thing. So beware the fact that it's just your instinct is that it's wrong. Heart transplants are a good example of that. Facial transplants are another more recent example where people think, it's horrible, isn't it? But that's not the basis of ethics. Similarly, beware of the wow factor that says, this is just so fascinating, we have to do it because I want to know. And actually to think, why do I want to know? What's the outcome of the sorts of things? I would love to resurrect a Neanderthal, but I think it's questionable as to whether it would be right for us to do it or right for the Neanderthal should we ever do so. So how do we make decisions? Some of it would be what I would call deontological, to use the technical phrase. It's in terms of law or duty. The Christian, the Ten Commandments are a good start of the way that we should behave. And there are other elaborations of that in terms of Christian character that we will see within the New Testament as well. But the thing about laws, and there are laws and regulations and duties for the scientist. Now, you can't do lots of experiments unless you've actually gone through the ethical approval first of all. The thing about laws is that human nature is to say, what can I get away with? Can I bend the laws? Can I twist them? What's the limits I can push? And we know too, the scripture tells us the letter kills, but the spirit gives life. Laws themselves, rules are necessary. They're not wrong, but they're not in themselves sufficient. We need something beyond that. People say, well, in terms of making ethical decisions, we might go for those that make people happy. The greatest happiness for the greatest number. And that sounds fine at first glance, but what does that say about minorities? What does that say about the oppressed and the vulnerable, the poor in society? Some people may say, well, we need to think about the consequences, and we maybe balance risks against positive outcomes. A lot of what we'll critique in the bioethical field is the risks of some of the ethical, biological things that we might be able to do. Is it just a matter of risk? If we can get rid of the risks, is everything fine? The words of Jesus, when accused of healing on the Sabbath, I think throw some things out for us, actually asking, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill? Right? I think that's quite an important principle to bear in mind. Maybe for the Christian, a virtue-based ethic is probably the strongest one. It's one that's based on character. The question to be asked then is not what should I do, but what sort of a person should I be? How can I, in what the things that I do, the technologies that I apply, and the science that I practice, how can I show love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness, faithfulness, gentleness and self-control? You'll know where that list comes from. The medics have been thinking about ethics for a long time, and the principles, their principle basically doing good and not doing harm. Well, those frequently conflict each other. No gain without pain. The principle of autonomy is that the individual has some form of a choice and a say in what's going on. And the principle of justice, and that you treat all people equally in the procedures that you do. So let's bear those in mind as we look at a few issues. Within the past 20 years, I think one of the greatest scientific achievements has been the sequencing of the human genome. 2001, the first draft of that released, and there have been various updates on that since then. We now know the sequence of the 3 billion letters that make up the human genome, that roughly 1 in every 1,000 of it varies between you and the person sat next to you, that makes you distinct. And there are various companies now that you can get sequence information from. You can have your DNA tested. Can I ask anybody here had their DNA tested? You are a most unusual group of people. There are often DNA testing kits given as Christmas presents to the family. Come back to that in a moment. So there are a number of companies that do that. I put some of, I think, the major players on that, 23andMe and Ancestry.com. They can say things about your health risks. They can say sometimes with a certain degree of improbability or rather uncertainty where you come from. They can tell you things about your responses to medicines, about what sort of things lifestyle should have. Not all of them are equally serious. Here's one that a researcher in my group discovered. A company called LifePro, Superhero. It tests your superhero assessment. Tell you whether you've got BAM or Eureka or Zoom, which is basically whether you've got strength or intelligence or speed. When you look at the fine detail on that, you find actually they're only testing, I think, 1 or 2 genes within each one of those characteristics, which are multigenomic, composed of lots and lots of genes interacting together. And the fine print at the bottom, if you look very carefully, says it's not a diagnostic test, and if you want anything serious, go and see a medic. But nonetheless, a lot of people have had these DNA tests. These DNA screening, it can be extremely useful for forensics, for scene of crime. It can be useful for paternity testing. Now that's a positive thing sometimes, and others it's a negative. If you give one of those to your family as a Christmas present, then be very wary if your wife looks aghast at the possibility. Because there are examples cited where people have done that, and actually the sins of the past have suddenly become apparent. And the paternity of the children is not who they thought it was. And that sometimes the sins of the past are best forgotten and put behind. And it has on occasion wrecked stable families because things unknown have been brought to light. It can tell you a little bit about susceptibility to disease. We'll say a little bit about it in a moment. That's always to do with probabilities and how little do the general public understand about probability. It can, if done properly, you should be done associated with genetic counselling. There are questions as to whether it could be done for prenatal screening, and it might have the benefits of being able to prescribe personalized medicines. What is the medicine for you that's going to give the best result and the fewest side effects? But it does run the question of then who should know when you get your results? Obviously, you want to know, that you've asked for it. But should you tell your children? And should you tell your parents? Because there'll be genes in common for those. They may want to know. Should you tell your GP? Should you tell your insurers that you're at risk of some heart condition in your mid-40s? Your insurance premium will rocket. Should you tell your employer? Because if they know you're going to drop dead, you're likely to drop dead in your mid-40s, why should they invest in you for a career that's going to be cut short? Public misunderstanding. There's a classic case of this now, and it's an MP revealed that he'd done through those tests, and the tests showed that he had an increased risk of prostate cancer. But when you look in detail at that, it showed that he actually had a 15% risk of developing prostate cancer by the age of 75, which sounds you want to do something about it. And he says, the truth is that saved my life. The truth is that the average expectancy of getting prostate cancer at that age is actually slightly higher than that, so he has a slightly reduced risk. And a geneticist at University College London says his claim this test may have saved his life is frankly ridiculous. And it actually exposes that people don't understand what to do with some of the scientific data that's presented to them. We could test babies at birth. And there was a study done in last year, appeared in the American Journal of Human Genetics, where they sequenced 5,000 crucial genes in just over 150 infants. And bizarrely, it showed a massive risk in that. 9% of those had some form of genetic problem that would otherwise have not been discovered. And do we actually run the risk of then having the worried well? Those who don't understand what the risks are of something. And the person conducting the study said, whoops, it's on that one. Many parents declined to participate in the study because they didn't want to imagine that the beautiful, healthy baby that they brought into the world could in some way be a little bit defective. So what does it reveal that we don't want to know? We could use it postnatally, prenatally, even pre-implantation to discover things. But what's the consequences of that? It raises questions about when life begins and what it means to be human. Postnatally, we would expect would say what sort of lifestyle should that young child live? Are there any dietary changes that should be brought in? Prenatally, rather often is brought with it the suggestion that, well, actually that child is going to be diseased and deformed and therefore should be aborted. That's a totally different issue. And pre-implantation, well, we'll come back to that later. Genetic screening, of course, there are a number of genetically inherited diseases that we can screen for. Tay-Sachs disease is prevalent amongst the Ashkenazi Jews. Other people get that as well, but it's higher incidence amongst them. And thalassemia, particularly amongst those of Mediterranean origin, Cypriots and the Greek Orthodox. And they have systems of being able to test for whether they are carriers of those genes, and then be able to give genetic counselling to young couples as should they have children, should they pursue the relationships, that people are acting on the basis of knowledge, not ignorance. A book published, I think last year, maybe the year before, by Robert Plumin, entitled Blueprint. And there's some, I think, rather threatening words within that. He says that DNA isn't all that matters, but it matters more than everything else put together. He said nice parents have nice children because they're all nice genetically. Whoa. His studies are actually based on something called whole genome-wide association studies. And it's what he called polygenic scores. It's not looking at the influence of one gene. Most behavioral things, a lot of physiological things are not the consequence of one gene acting alone. They're the consequence of a whole network of genes interacting with each other. And they're probabilistic rather than deterministic. And those sorts of things are fine averaging out against populations, but they're no good for actually saying what will happen to you as an individual. I say many things are multigenic. There's not a gene for. So we might think about intelligence. There's the figures that there's at least 74 genetic markers that contribute to educational achievement, but they only actually account for less than 1% of the total intelligence. In fact, a good education is far better than necessary than those genes. Type 2 diabetes, over at least 36 genes in that. Height, hundreds of genes controlling something like height. So things interact together. So as we look at genetic modification, we are under risk of going through what I will call genetic reductionism. The sort of genes are us fallacy, that I'm nothing more than the sum of my genes. And to some extent, we almost make a god out of DNA. We shouldn't tinker with it because it's sacred, and it's somehow mysteriously determining who I am. We are far more than just the sum of our genes, and we shouldn't subscribe to genetic fatalism. Step back for a moment and ask the question, so what does this wonderful molecule DNA do? It's the repository of our genetic information that is transcribed into RNA, translated into proteins, and proteins are the bulk stuff that make you and I up. They're responsible for our metabolism, our structure, our organization, our development, etc., etc. DNA itself, what does it do? Well, it actually does everything, and it does nothing. A bottle of DNA on the bench will just simply sit there. In fact, it will probably decay over time. It only does something in the context of the cell that it's in, and the cell in the context of the organism, and the organism actually in the context of the community of other individuals that we live. Nonetheless, DNA, the code for that is universal. And because the DNA coding is exactly the same in a bacterium and a virus as it is in a banana and in a human being, we can take genes and move them around between different organisms because the coding is exactly the same. So we can do genetic modification. And yet that very phrase rings alarm bells with many people. Are we playing God? Are we breaking with nature? And we'll ask, what is natural? Is there risks associated? We're crossing species boundaries. What does it mean to be human? Who owns my DNA sequence information? Actually, if you do those DNA tests, they may be anonymous, but somebody owns that, and the drug companies are using that information, hopefully beneficially. We need to be careful about the words that we use, how many unhelpful phrases, particularly in the popular press, frankenfoods, right? Genetic pollution. Even the word genetics frightens people. Or genetic engineering. Engineering sounds so cold and calculated, quality control, quantifiable, rather than being human. And we'll come back to it, the very phrase three-parent embryos that I'm sure you've heard about is actually a misnomer. Are we playing at God? Well, that rather suggests that there are boundaries that we shouldn't cross. It rather suggests that we're playing. I'm sorry, but most of the scientists that I interact with are not playing. They're very serious about their studies, and many are doing it for the benefit of humankind, or at least human knowledge. If we're created in the image of God, who is the ultimate creator, maybe we too should be creative. Is that part of the image of God in us? We're required to look after the world, and that may mean curating it, changing it in some way, tilling the soil, not just leaving it to deal with itself. But are there boundaries to that responsibility? And for the Christian, we know that healing and restoration and feeding of the poor have always been part of the Christian's duties. So look at a few of these. So what is natural? Right? Here's a beautiful scenic view of part of the Lake District. And you're like, isn't nature wonderful? That is not natural. Right? That is curated by humans over centuries. It would largely probably be totally forested if we hadn't done things with it. So beware when you use that natural. What about the foods that we eat? If I harvested our sweet corn and it looked like that, I'd feel it hadn't done very well. That's probably native maize before we selected high-yielding crops. And on the left is primitive popcorn. Right? You wouldn't find that particularly appetizing. We have changed things over centuries. And actually, many of the economically useful varieties that we have are not natural. Some of them have been selected just by picking out the ones that are the highest yielding. Some have been selected after deliberately mutating them with in occasions carcinogenic agents, with X-rays. And this is not new technology. These are things that were done way back in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Imprecise genetic engineering. So we need to be careful when we talk about what is natural. Many of the things that we eat now are not natural, not in the strict sense. Why should we do genetic modification? Well, one is to do with food security, for feeding the world. One is maybe to do with medical reasons, for research, for curiosity. Some research is done for egos, let's be fair. Scientists are no different to the rest of the population. They have egos too. And then commerce comes into it. Not that there's anything wrong with commerce. Be fair, when you go down to the local supermarket, they're not selling you your vegetables out of the kindness of their heart, out of any social benefit. They're selling it because they want to make money. And we need to ask the question, who will benefit for any GM? Will it be the poor and the needy, or will it simply put more power into the hands of the rich? But look, some of the GM applications that have been useful. Golden rice, fortified with vitamin A, so for areas of the world where vitamin A deficiency is a problem. For crops that are engineered to be drought resistant, that in the changing climate that we're in, where droughts and floods become more common, then these are hardier crops. Many pharmaceuticals are made by GM now. Insulin is not extracted from pig cadavers, but is genetically made by microorganisms. Growth hormone, Herceptin, so one of the monoclonal antibodies used for treating breast cancer is genetically modified. Interferon, an antiviral agent. ZMapp, you may have come across as the antibody for treating Ebola, is actually engineered and produced through tobacco plants. So maybe GM can help feed the world. 1 in 6 of the world's population is hungry today, and we have to increase food production by between 70 and 100% by the year 2050. And can the science of genetic modification help? We do need to ask questions, though. Is it safe? Pretty much all genetically modified foods have been well tested. They're not toxic. So you could eat them. There's no problem with that. Is it natural? Well, I've already dealt with that. I think that may sometimes be a wrong question to ask. Is it fair? I think that is a real question to ask. Hugh and I were in Ghana recently with doing a Faraday course out there. And they were concerned about genetic modification because it seemed as though it was Western exploitation. Again, it was the Westerner trying to impose things on their Ghanaian culture. And we need to ask, is it needed? And in some instances, yes, and in others, no. Whatever we do with genetic modification, though, we have to make sure the public accept it, rather than sneak it through and enforce it on people. And here's a quotation: the technology, in this case for improving crop yields, the public would have to change its opinion on genetic engineering. If it's to be used in wheat or rice, then they'd have to get the crop accepted in the general populace. Francis Collins, director of the National Institute of Health, who was director of the Human Genome Project and is a practicing Christian, puts the boot on the other foot to say that genetic engineering is unacceptable across the board because of its potential for creating some ethical dilemmas is actually an unethical stance. It's to say we have a powerful approach which could alleviate some human suffering, but we're not going to use it because we're worried about the misuses that might occur. And he says, I find that completely unacceptable from every point of view. You have to make a decision at some stage. I'm going to skip past a few of these, I think, about the embryo. And I will just say a little bit about mitochondrial DNA transfer. 3-parent babies, as it's called. Mitochondria are the powerhouses of our cells. They that generate the energy, the ATP, to put its chemical term on it, biochemical term. But mitochondria can have a small number of genes of their own. It accounts for 0.17% of the total genetic content of of our cells, and they're inherited exclusively from the mother and not from the father. And mitochondrial mutations can cause some serious diseases. So mitochondrial DNA transfer is to take the mitochondria from a healthy embryo and transfer them into a one that has mutated mitochondria. So it's a form of genetic modification, but it's only taking a very small component, those mitochondria themselves. And actually there's very little in terms of the variation between people and mitochondria that makes any physiological difference apart from those disease states. So, and it then is then can be inherited, of course, for the next generation through the mother. It's that some people feel uncomfortable about that. But essentially, that's mitochondrial transplant. We're used to heart transplants and lung transplants and liver transplants. Why are we that much more worried about a mitochondrial transplant than we are about some of those other transplants that are used to alleviate disease states? There's questions about, as we drill down to this sort of level, about stem cells. Stem cells, they're unspecialized cells with an ability to for self-renewal. Most of the cells in your body have a limited lifespan. They can only divide 40 times. It's called the Hayflick limit for very good scientific reasons. But stem cells are ones that they self-perpetuate, self-renew, have an almost infinite amount of ability to divide. And therefore, to isolate stem cells, they can be used for replacement cells, for diseased or damaged tissues. Excuse me. And the normal cellular repair processes have used those natural stem cells that are parked in the body, and they're present in all tissues. The question with the stem cell therapy is, where do we get the stem cells from? You could isolate them from adults, from the particular tissue, but at that stage, they're tissue specific. So you get a heart stem cell, or a lung stem cell, or a kidney stem cell. So they're very difficult to isolate, and they're very difficult to use, which is where embryo research comes into this. If we think at the top there's our newly fertilized single cell, which all of us have originated from originally, this combination of the sperm and the egg. And that divides through 1 to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16 to 32, and then becomes a sort of a ball of cells at this stage. Further divisions lead us to this stage here, where what we have in this little thing here called the inner cell mass is actually what's going to go on to make the fetus. The rest of it around there is going to go on to make the placenta. And it's these cells here that can be harvested. The original cell here obviously is totipotent, it's called. It can do anything. This cell here can't do anything because it can't make a placenta, but it can make a human being. So if you isolate those pluripotent cells, they can then go on to make all kinds of different tissues. So the source of those stem cells, in many cases, is embryos. So in order to make them, you have to destroy an embryo. And many people find that ethically unacceptable. It does quite raise the question as what is the status of a human embryo? The other side of the coin, though, is to where do those embryos come from? And you cannot, legally in this country, at least in many others, generate them specially for that purpose. They're leftover, they're surplus embryos from in vitro fertilization. So which is ethically the best? To dispose of those surplus embryos because they're surplus to requirements, or to use them for a benefit of health? We could talk about that later on. In terms of our genetics, we know the basis of many diseases. Some are point mutations in our DNA, some are rearrangements of the DNA, some are expansions of bits of DNA, or something's gone wrong in that and therefore leads to a genetic disease. Wouldn't it be nice if we could just edit it? Take out the nasty bits and replace it with with the nice bits, a sort of cut and paste of genetics. And until recently that was impossible, but now there are various technologies that allow that to take place. And the one you'll come across most frequently in the media is CRISPR-Cas9. Needn't worry about what that stands for. Here's somebody writing on that every once in a while a scientific discovery is made whose impact on society is likely to be so immense that even an abundance of superlatives may not do it full justice. Genome editing looks like that sort of a discovery. And there have been some remarkable ways in which it's been used for actually taking, in this case, a child who had leukemia and taking some of her blood cells and genetically modifying them and putting them back into the patient after various bits of trickery, molecular biology that we needn't go into. And this girl who was at death's door, effectively, is in remission. So wonderful therapy based on modifying DNA. But that's with somatic cell mutation. That's the whole organism. That's not the adult, but the developed organism. It's taking place in the body's cells. What about germ cell mutation? The eggs, the gametes. That will not just affect that individual, but every generation beyond that. Can it be done? Well, the answer is yes, it can. It was first done experimentally back in 2015 on embryos that actually they never could have gone on to be implanted anyway. They were unhealthy, but shown it could be done. Can it lead to production of organisms? Well, it's been done on monkeys to show that it's possible to modify them. And then just over a year ago, there was the outcry of this Chinese scientist who managed to do that on human embryos, breaking all the rules. Never yet published in any scientific literature, but I think well believable. It has been widely denounced by the scientific community. Widely denounced because, firstly, it's unnecessary. There was no therapeutic requirement for doing that, no health benefit. Risk is, as you edit one gene, you run the risk as you might edit another one unintentionally. The technology is very good. It's extremely precise, but it's not absolutely precise. He hadn't gone through ethical approval. Don't misunderstand things. The Chinese have ethical approval systems just the same as we do here. They may be different, but he'd skipped all of those, and there was limited or no parental consent. But supposing we could do it, is that just a form of embryo healing? Is it a form of healing and restoration? The ways that have been part of Christian understanding for centuries. That's at the, if you like, of a possibility of a genetic disease that would be life-threatening. But let me ask some questions about that. Should we modify the genome of an embryo that will otherwise die of a genetic disease? That's bringing life where there wouldn't have been one. Should we modify the genome of an embryo that will, say, have a life-changing condition, such as cystic fibrosis, where their life expectancy will be reduced? Should we modify the genome of an embryo that will develop a condition later on in life? Again, you're talking about probability. Huntington's disease is not probability. If you've got the mutation there, you will get Huntington's disease. It's an awful disease, and a colleague of mine died of that recently. What about breast cancer and the BRCA2 gene? Should we modify an embryo that will develop something later in life? Or should we modify an embryo that would do something cosmetic, like change their eye color? Everybody says that we shouldn't do it. All the agencies said that for the moment, until we've sorted it out, we must not do it. But that's not to stop the rogue scientists from doing it. People with disabilities, and we need to think very carefully about this. Tom Shakespeare, as a spokesperson for the disabled, says some very useful things. And he says that people with disabilities are not queuing up for genetic modification. They're queuing up for combating discrimination and prejudice. The voices of people living with illness and impairment need to be heard. What is disability? Is being deaf a disability? A court case a few years ago of deaf parents, those who are genetically deaf, asked if they could select an embryo that would also be deaf, because they wanted that child to be part of the deaf community. Deafness isn't a culture, it isn't a disability, it's a culture, they say. And we know too that Paul talked about the thorn in the flesh and learned that God's power is made perfect in weakness. Now, Christians shouldn't accept disease too lightly, with a sort of fatalism that sees everything as part of God's will. But what seems like a disease for some people can actually bring strength and opportunity for others. I come back to one of the passages that I quoted earlier, Jesus saying, is it lawful to do good or to do harm? To save life or to kill? Challenging the Pharisees' interpretation of scriptures that you just shouldn't do anything on the Sabbath. I'm running out of time, and I can see Ruth twitching there. We could talk for a long time about genetic enhancement, about should we modify humans so as to make them optimal, to increase your athletic prowess, to make you more intelligent, etc. Should we reinvent ourselves? And there have been a number of things on that. Again, don't edit the human genome is the message that's coming out from the ethical community, from the scientific community. But it does ask the question of how do we treat people? And I'll begin to draw to a close with this. Do we treat people as commodities or as individuals? Francis Collins, quoting again, said the application of germline manipulation would change our view of the value of human life. If genomes are being altered to suit parents' preferences, do children become more like commodities than precious gifts? We don't choose our children, they're presented to us and we love them. This is taking your child off the shelf, an extension of the parent's ego rather than an individual in themselves. Imagine those of you who've got have or had teenage children, imagine the teenager's response. You did that to me? Huh? What? You had me modified? And so we need to be very, very careful about that sort of thing. We ask the question again, what is normal? There is actually only one normal person in this room, and he's lecturing you at the moment. And you will also think that there's only one normal person, and that is you. Most people acknowledge that there is a diversity amongst humans. We speak about an athlete's or a musician's gift. It's something that's contingent. You take what you've got and you make the most of it. And excellence is actually working on what you've got, doing the best with what you have. I will never make a prize athlete because I've got the wrong genes. And sometimes understanding that in a democratic society is actually quite difficult. We all we think it should be a level playing field for everybody, genetically as well as socially. But human life, isn't it, is a gift and not an achievement. Can we change people's behavior? Wow, there's something called the Genetic Virtue Project. Oh, well, we will skip past that, I think. But we behave by choice, not because we're genetically programmed to be good, but because we are human beings with choice, made in the image of God. And I want to just finish with those words from the psalmist, Psalm 139. Writing, before we knew anything about the way in which an embryo developed in the womb, before we knew anything about molecular biology at all, before anything was known about those processes that are so wonderful, says, you created my inmost being, you knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. And at that point, I'll finish. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. And I'm sure there are lots of questions. Please wait until I point you out and the microphone comes before starting to speak. And I think we have the first question here on the front row.
Keith, thank you. Wonderful. Very simple question to start with. Genome manipulation suddenly became germline. What's the difference?
So you could manipulate the genome of an adult, right, who has a genetic condition. That has a limited degree of success because you've got to modify enough cells within that individual to be able to do that. And once you do that, of course, it is specific to that particular individual, right? So if it's an adult, obviously they're consenting to it. They know the risks involved with it. If you do it with germline, there's no consent, and it's permanent. Is that once it's in the germline, of course, it will then go into the next generation, the next, and the next. So there's no way back. Whereas the somatic cell, as it's done, so the individual, it is just for that individual themselves. And I think in that case, in most instances, we say therapeutically there probably isn't a problem if we're dealing with a disease. There would still be a problem if we're dealing with, say, gene doping for an athlete, of being able to insert enough copies of a gene that, say, make you run faster. That would be a problem still.
Yeah, we'll go to the back and then
I wondered if you could clarify slightly, following on from the question about germline versus other types of modification. So you talked about germline modification, which is generally accepted to be a bad thing. You mentioned embryo selection, which I believe is permitted for certain severe conditions. And then you also mentioned sort of 3-parent babies or mitochondrial transplant. But isn't that also creating a new germline?
Yes, take each of those in turn. You're quite right that embryo selection, which is allowed for detecting certain genetic diseases, so that in vitro fertilization will take place, then a cell from the new embryo will be taken and tested to see did it contain the mutant gene or the correct gene, and then you'd only implant the correct one. That raises questions of then what you do with the one that has the mutation, and in many instances that will either go for research or be destroyed. So there's that. If you do genome modification, you have to do embryo selection anyway to see which ones have been modified. So are those who will say at the moment, what's the point in doing genome modification? Because it doesn't achieve anything that can't be done by embryo selection. There are 1 or 2 examples where you can't do it by embryo selection, particularly if there are a number of different mutations and the chances of finding a healthy embryo are very remote. So there's that. The 3-parent baby thing, well, yes, you're right. You are changing something in the genes that will be passed on to the next generation. But there's nothing in those mitochondrial genes that in any way affects one person more than another one. The mitochondria, there are differences in mitochondrial sequence one person to another, but as far as we know, they don't change any of our physiology and any of our well-being, if you like. Unlike obviously changing something that's muscle strength or intelligence, that would be very, very different. Now there are those who will say, well, we still shouldn't do it because it's changing the human the human line. It is, if you like, it's not inserting anything new. It's simply correcting it's taking what's naturally there in another human being in the mitochondria alone and putting it into a diseased cell. So it's, if you like, it's shuffling a little bit the genetic complement rather than introducing anything new. But it's a very real question.
Thanks. You mentioned Steven Pinker and Steve Jones at the beginning, sort of saying ethicists should get out of the way. And then in relation to the Chinese work, you said there was a very broad consensus that it was wrong. And I wonder if you can say something about what are the influences or the influencers upon that broader ethical assessment of this work? Yeah,
there are ethical questions as to why some of the scientists think it's ethically wrong. And some of their motivation for doing that is if it goes wrong, then the public will turn against us and they'll take our funding away. Right? I don't think that's a proper ethical argument. There are a large number. So Jennifer Doudna, who really was the pioneer in the whole CRISPR-Cas, is a very strong advocate for stopping embryo research altogether. And is not doing, as far as I know, not doing that from any position of faith at all. I think most scientists are fairly responsible people who understand that we shouldn't be tinkering around with these things, at least until we know what the consequences are. I think that's probably what's in most scientists' minds, is once we know what the risk is and we can minimize the risk, then we should go ahead and do it. After all, there are plenty of risks associated with conception by the natural normal mechanism. And if we can reduce the risks of modification to that sort of level, some people will say, well, so what? I mean, George Church is another one for synthetic biology, genome modification, would actually say, well, so let's go on, let's do it. Partly, I think, because just the fascination of doing it in some instances, rather than necessarily for any benefit to humankind. But I would say across the board, in the scientific, at least the biological community, is a consensus that this shouldn't be done. And all the research funders in this country and in the US have actually made public statements that say, no, the legislation is quite clear, you don't do it.
I could also add, should the church be thinking about what it means to be having a family? Do we have an inalienable right to have our own biological children, which is the agenda that's driving this very expensive technology, let alone the risks and, and the effects on society of that, A, that attitude, and B, the availability of technology to those people in societies that can afford it.
I think that is a question that needs to be addressed, is the right to have children. I don't think I can speak to that because I am a father of 3 very healthy and now adults, and I don't think I have a right to be able to speak to those who desperately want children and want healthy children who can't. I don't think I have a right to speak for those who bring up a child with a genetic disability, because I haven't experienced that, and I think there is that personal level we need to grapple with. The other side of should the church be saying something about this is actually what happens if genetic modification gets out of hand and somebody does it, right? So there will be a rogue scientist. We may be able to put all the rules and regulations in place that say don't do it, and somebody will. I'm sorry, that's just human nature. So I think we need, firstly, to get our brains around what are we going to do with the genetically modified child? And my answer is that they're human, like you and like me, and they're made in the image of God in a fallen nature, and they need our love and care in the same way as all of us do, and they're loved and cared for by God in the same way. So they're not a freak, right? They're not a museum piece. They're not something to be put in a zoo or be made media hype. They're just a human being like you and like me. And we need to get our brains around that, first of all, I think, because somebody will do it.
Yes, there's one more question at the back. Yes, gentleman in the green.
Thank you. That was really thought-provoking, and I suspect all of us are sitting here and thinking, oh, not sure about that one. Can I just, more as a comment than a question, just expand it and to say that even when you get beyond the point at which we don't any longer think it's an ethical issue, that's not the end point for Christians engaging and thinking about the problems. And I mean, in my field, I work for a cancer charity. Let me give you a specific example. You mentioned drugs designed for people with particular genetic changes. There is a drug which works for breast cancer patients who have those BRCA mutations. That's a fantastic scientific story. Nobody would argue that that's an ethical problem, but there are still problems that Christians need to engage with about access to those drugs and pricing and the developmental and the costing model for doing that sort of research once you've got past the scientific questions. So I would urge everybody in the audience to think even more broadly about some of these issues.
Absolutely, and this goes on for like public health and medicine, which I'm not qualified to talk about, but I agree that many of the monoclonal drugs that are used for treating cancers are exceptionally expensive. And it's awful to say so, but sometimes we need to make economic decisions. And I said one of the ethical principles we should go by is justice. There is no justice across the world in this. The sorts of sums of money that are spent prolonging the life of a cancer patient with a very expensive drug could be used for saving the lives of thousands of children in Africa who are suffering from purely treatable, very cheaply treatable diseases. So there are those horrible ethical, economical issues that need to be borne in mind. And they're too complicated for my tiny mind to deal with. But thank you ever so much for raising that.
We have a few more minutes. If there are any more questions, there's several. So some of this discussion will have to happen over coffee. But yes, there's one question over here.
For some while, I think.
Given the situation in the United States, particularly over abortion now, when do we move from being a collection of dividing cells to being a human?
Thank you for that. And there's a diversity of views for that. Personally, I have a very strong view that once the developing embryo is implanted in the womb, that is a point at which of no return. So I would be against abortion after that point. I don't have a problem with embryo research, but there are plenty of people asking questions. Is an embryo in a dish that may be 1 cell, 2, 4, 8 cells? Is that a human being? Well, no, it's not, right? But has it the potential to be a human being, a unique human being? Yes, it does. And where do you draw the line? And different religions, even different strains of Christian thought, have divided over that over time. We've come a long way, haven't we, since the Roman times, when you could abort the fetus probably up until the age, well, indefinitely. I used to tell my children that when they were misbehaving, that maybe we should have abortion until the fetus is several years old. But infanticide in Rome was common. Right? You didn't like the child, throw it on the dump. And actually it was Christians who played a real part in changing the attitude to that this is something that we should care for and love. So there's a variety of different views as to when is it uniquely human and we should protect it. I can give my own view on that, but there are deep Christian thinkers who say that you shouldn't do anything with an embryo at all. That effectively is a human being, in which case often a lot of stem cell research then should be forbidden. There are others who say that you can do that up to a certain stage. The law at the moment for research on it is you cannot generate embryos for research, and those that after 14 days the experiments have to be stopped. And it's roughly at that sort of time when there start to be some form of distinctive features begin to appear. It doesn't look like a human at that stage, but there's some specialization in the cells that says, the beginning of a nervous system. So it's a very complicated, very real question. Thank you ever so much for it. And there'll be a diversity of views, I'm sure, amongst us here.
Great, thank you, Keith. Well, I think we'll leave it there and leave other questions to happen over coffee later. Thank you very much, Keith.
Thank you.